Capitalism, throughout the years, has transitioned from a concept originating in a very particular parlance into a term of familiarity to almost everyone, in one way or another. Regardless of this, it has always been used in the context of deep contradiction between those who believe in its power and those who oppose it. Capitalism, for us who are struggling, making ends meet, who are constantly at the threat of horrendous flooding, or those who are only one hospital stay away from being bankrupt and other dehumanizing predicaments, has always thought of capitalism as the identified problem of the people. But as a controversial take, what we must recognize now is that whether we like it or not, we are part of capitalism. No matter how much we speak ill of it, it maintains its nigh omnipresence over our lives. Whether it is conscious or unconscious, we are operating within the playground of capitalism. But I know a lot of us cannot accept this. And again, that is why it is controversial. And in order to overcome the force of capitalism, we must first meditate on this uncomfortable reality. And that is why we must first identify how our mode of living has been shaped by capitalism in a way justifies its rationalization as well. Everyone, good morning and welcome to the public lecture titled How Capitalism Affirms Its Hegemony, the Imperial Mode of Living. And this is organized by the UP Third World Studies Center in collaboration with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Southeast Asia, Manila. And today, I will be your moderator. I am Jules Politico. I am a University Research Associate at the UP Third World Studies Center. And for today, our objective is again to discuss or to examine the imperial mode of living or the articulation of how our everyday practices and identities heavily rely on the inhumane labor, the exploitation of nature, and the unjust distribution of resources. Now, as a reminder, this lecture forum will be recorded, but it will not be streamed live on social media due to a scheduled internet connectivity disruption inside the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, but we will be uploading the recorded lecture later on in YouTube. So if gusto niyo pong balikan yung discussion natin, pwede niyo po siyang tingnan. And we would also like to inform everyone, and again, we also would like to inform everyone if ever na kailangan niyo pong mag-CR, we also have a CR sa may lobby. And then please avoid drinking or eating within the venue premises. And now, to begin our program, we call on the Deputy Director of the UP Third World Studies Center, Professor Jely Galang, for their opening message.
Magandang umaga po sa lahat. Kumusta po kayo? Good morning, everyone. The UP Third World Studies Center, an academic research institute based at the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, welcomes you all to this lecture by Professor Ulrich Brand of the University of Vienna. Professor Brand and the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Manila invited the center, our center, to co-organize this very worthwhile event. It primarily aims to provide a venue for knowledge sharing and exchange among scholars, activists, researchers, and enthusiasts from Germany and the Philippines who are interested in the study and critique of capitalism and related themes and subjects. Professor Brand's lecture today, based on the book he co-authored with Markus Wissen, titled Imperial Mode of Living, will emphasize how this concept, they call it the Imperial Mode of Living, has led and continues to lead to, quote, uneven development and a constant and accelerating universalization of a Western mode of production and living, unquote. As will be explained further in the talk, this imperial mode of living highlights the crucial role of capitalism in the emergence, development, and intensification of environmental crisis, as well as economic challenges and political instability. And while such concept has generally been conceived and developed from historical and contemporary global experiences, its application is very much relevant in understanding societies, especially in the global south, like the Philippines. For instance, how can this concept and other related concepts that Professor Brand will talk about later help us interrogate perennial issues like poverty, corruption, and political dynasties in the Philippine setting? How can we utilize these concepts in unpacking current concerns such as ideological degradation, ghost flood control projects, and the purchasing of a Rolls-Royce car just to get a free umbrella? The considerable number of attendees in this lecture today, I believe, is a clear manifestation of the keen interest in the talk's subject matter, which we hope could in some way inspire and motivate people to think more critically and to act collectively. The UP Third World Studies Center excitedly looks forward to having more fruitful discussions such as this, and that this talk will be a step forward toward more collaborative projects and engagements with German scholars and institutions like the Rosa, Luxemburg, Stiftung, Manila in the future. Muli, maraming salamat po. Thank you very much. Magandang umaga po sa lahat.
And maraming salamat po, Sir Jely. At tulad po na nabanggit ni Sir Jely, maraming mga bagay pa yung kailangan natin articulate in the Philippine context, especially from a Western perspective. And maliban doon, it is also the start of a supposedly, or we hope to be, a lifelong collaboration. And when there is collaboration, there is also discussion. So tulad na nabanggit din kanina ni Sir Ulrich Brand, we do hope that this will become an open communication between us and the audience for today. Pero, sa ngayon, we will now be proceeding to the part that we are waiting for. So let us proceed to the main lecture of today. So our lecturer for today has been teaching and researching as Professor of International Politics at the Institute of Political Science at the University of Vienna since 2007. He has published work on sustainability transformation, the growth, historical materialist political analysis, and critical state theory. But his research is condensed into the concept that which we know of as the Imperial Mode of Living. He has been a member of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, where he serves as an academic trustee, and among other things, he is also a member of the board of Austrian Foundation for International Development, the SAB of Austrian Institute of International Politics, the Global Working Group Beyond Development, and the Permanent Working Group Beyond Development in Latin America. Ladies and gentlemen, let us kindly welcome Professor Ulrich Brand as he discusses the concept of the Imperial Mode of Living.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased, to be here. ¿Cómo está? I think is the form to say hello. I speak Spanish, but I'm learning that despite the Spanish colonial history, it's not so present, but I'm happy that we can communicate so fluently here in English. I'm happy to be here. Many thanks to Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, to IE Cairo, Xenia de la Cruz, Stefan Mensch, who cannot be here, he is in Hanoi. Many thanks to Francis Lo, Jewel for the moderation, Christopher Politico and Ramon Guillermo, we just met, to Dr. Dalisay, who cannot be here, and to Jely Galang for as a deputy director. And also thanks to the Austrian Agency for Education and Internationalization, which also enables my stay here. And thanks to everyone here in the room that you are interested in this topic. If it's not too boring, if you don't leave before the room, at the very end we were able, and many thanks to this fantastic technical support, we prepared a QR code that you can download the book. The publisher is not very much in favor of it, but I think it's good that knowledge is available, and then you can just get it. my position here, my positionality, if you like, is that I come from Europe, my experience is Europe. I have, if you like, a northern perspective with a lot of background on Latin America. I spent 3 years of my life in Latin America. I'm for the first time in the Philippines. But have this please in mind, also when it comes to my examples, that my background is really Europe, and even there Western Europe, because of course also Europe is divided, has its own semi-periphery. What I want to do in the next 50 minutes is to share 4 thoughts, and then I'm very keen to learn from you, from the commentators, and also from our discussion here in the room. What is a bit from for us, for Markus Wissen and myself, when we started to write the book, to think about the concept Imperial Mode of Living 15 years ago, what was the concept, the context? This is my first consideration, but when we look back, the starting point of our work was the financial and economic crisis in 2007-2008. And in Germany and Austria, the most successful crisis policy was the so-called scrapping bonus. It was a bonus which was given to people, 2,500 euro in Germany, when you destroyed your already still existing and still functioning car to buy a new car. So you gave away your old car, still functioning old car, got 2,500 euro and bought a new car to stabilize the economy which was in crisis. And the state was in favor of it, the companies were in favor of it, the trade unions were in favor of it, and people loved it. It was the most successful policy ever, not ever, but in Germany and in Austria. So we started to think, what happens that in light of the climate crisis, in light of a certain politicization of north-south unequal relations, the resources we need for the production of cars, etc., etc. Why is such a policy that people have to destroy their already still functioning cars? Why it is so successful and so attractive? This brought us a bit to the Imperial Mode of Living, the concept I will outline in the second consideration. The third consideration this morning is a new book which will come out, Capitalism at the Limit, with Polity Press in end of this year. I don't have a QR code yet, but maybe in 1 or 2 years we can gather again, and I hope, as you said already, we will have a more constant exchange. In the new book, we try to understand how dominant political forces and dominant economic forces, but also from a progressive perspective, what are the attempts to deal with the crisis, to deal with the ecological crisis, to deal with the crisis of injustice, etc., etc. And we detect 3 different projects. And I just want to get you through briefly to these projects. And one of the projects we call a solidary mode of living, which is my final and my 4th consideration. And then we will have comments and a tea. So I start, and I hope that it works. This one, yes, thank you. Yeah. No. So, pressing global, what motivated us to develop the concept of Imperial Mode of Living? And one is, of course, the crisis of 2007, 2008, I already mentioned. Then afterwards, the corona pandemic, the war, or the wars we have in Europe. And there is, of course, there are discontinuities, and probably you study it, you have it in your seminars, or people do research on it. There is a change. I would say also there's a crisis of neoliberal globalization. A prominent concept is now deglobalization. It's not the term Gordon Bellow prominently here from UP coined 20 years ago. Deglobalization from Gordon Bellow was really to create alternatives for the local economies, for local people. But the current deglobalization means largely that there is a reconcentration, a reshoring, a nearshoring of the industries in the respective regions. Donald Trump, he is kind of one of the promoters of deglobalization. getting back the industry to the United States. So the neoliberal globalization is in crisis in a very ambiguous sense, but there are also continuities. We still have a very strong financialized capitalism, we have still very strong financial and industrial power, and we have, excuse for the mistake in the word, we have also an ongoing environmental destruction. We call this in the new book a monstrous normality. There is a desire of many people to get back to normality, to overcome the crisis, but in monstrous because normality, Imperial Mode of Living, means that we destroy our planet. The second problem is still an over-proportional access to and use of global resources. We know in the figures, you might be familiar with the so-called great acceleration, the resource use, the emissions, etc., since the Second World War, and there is still, despite all knowledge about the problems we have, still an overuse of global resources. Third, and this brings us closer to the Imperial Mode of Living, there is still an attractiveness of the Western way of life, of the American way of life. Also in the emerging economies, if you go to China, to others, and I'm not familiar with the Philippines, but there is still a very, very strong attraction of to have cars, to eat meat, to produce it as well, to produce cars, to produce meat, etc., to be modern in a sense, to have fast fashion. And the fourth is the pressing problem, since we are here in Southeast Asia, which we need to understand, particularly in Europe, is there is still crisis externalization. There is still in the countries of the centers of the centers of capitalism. Please come here. There are still seats available. You don't have to stand. Come in. Yeah. There is still a crisis externalization in the sense that the crisis should take place elsewhere, not in the global north, but elsewhere. That the negative preconditions to get the resources, to produce things, the dirty industries, are in the global south, and this is also part of what we call crisis externalization. So, and then our proposal, Markus Wissen's and my proposal, to understand the political economy and also the cultural political economy of our problems and political ecology. It's a critical approach to sustainability studies, is precisely the concept of the Imperial Mode of Living. This is my second consideration. The basic idea is quite simple, and then we develop it further, and I get you through it, hopefully. The general idea is that we want to understand the persistence, but at the same time the crisis deepening patterns of production and consumption. If we think in cell phones, clothes, industrial food, a means of mobility as cars, etc., these patterns of production and consumption are based on an, in principle, unlimited appropriation of the resources and labor capacity. It's not only about resources, but also about labor capacity of both the global north and the global south, and a disproportionate claim to global things. So it means that if I think from Europe, that people in Europe have an everyday life that constantly refers to cheap labor and cheap nature within Europe, but also from the global south. This is the main idea. Imperial is not imperialistic. Imperial means that there is kind of an access to cheap labor and cheap nature from elsewhere, and mainly from other countries. So if you produce here in the Philippines or in Southeast Asia, you produce products also from the global north, not only from the Philippines, and these products are often produced under precarious, problematic economic, environmental and social conditions. And this is the imperial. And this is invisibilized. People in the global north, in Europe, don't think what are the conditions the cell phone or the clothes or the food is produced under. So, our economy refers to an elsewhere. And our economy, and this is a distinction to neoclassical economics, if you like. Neoclassical economics promises us always there will be a trickle-down effect. If there's enough growth, there will be, everybody will be better off. And we argue, no, the imperial mode of living is structurally exclusive. There must be the other side of the coin, the dirty side, the exploitative side of the coin within our societies, but also internationally. I go through a quote to make you understand that we come from critical theory. Some of you might have heard of the Frankfurt School, a critical theory which tries to understand the ambiguities we live in. It's not clear-cut negative, it's not clear-cut positive, but we want to understand the ambiguities, and I just read the quote to make you understand what we mean by the imperial mode of living. I quote, "The imperial mode of living is as much an enabling as a coercive relationship into which people are socialized by virtue of belonging to a capitalist society. It is attractive and desirable for many. At the same time, however, one cannot simply escape it. We cannot say we just don't want the imperial mode of living. The imperial mode of living is a structure we live in, a capitalist, patriarchal, colonial structure. It is meant to illustrate that the existential and mutual dependencies that are deeply rooted in economic, political, cultural relations and lead to very unequal life chances. Within our societies, if here in the Philippines, there is an enormous inequality within the Philippines, but also at the global level. The necessity to sell one's own labor power for wages, often having to serve in the production of social, ecological problematic goods, or the infrastructure of car-centered mobility and an agro-industrial food system leave many with little choice but to participate in the imperial mode of living." So it means it's not our bad intention that we live the imperial mode of living. We have to live it because it's a structure. It's our condition under which we live. I hope you get this main idea. So, not to be confused, capitalism, as Jewel also said in his introduction, capitalism is made. Capitalism has to do with strategies of power of investment. It's investment decisions. It's the desire and necessity to produce profits. It's the strategies of firms. It's the strategies of state, if we think in trade policies, etc., etc. It's neo-colonial politics. The North wants a new form, we call it now green colonialism. The greening of the North implies that now the nickel comes from Indonesia also for a greening of the economy, etc., etc. So it's about strategies. We should be clear about it, about interest. And it's about discourses. We have the discourse of progress, of development, of a good living, and this is also quite clear. But our point with the imperial mode of living is that beside interest, strategies, discourses, it's the inscription into the everyday life. It's that we live it, that many people have also a desire of an imperial mode of living to live better, and to live better means to have a larger car, scrapping bonus, my example from the beginning, to have success, which is then measured in material well-being, etc., etc. There is a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, you might have heard of, and he coined the term of habitus. That society, the power of society inscribes itself into our bodies, into our desires, into our thinking and wishes. So now I go a bit deeper. We detect in our book, this is part of the third chapter, 4 driving forces of the imperial mode of living. If you like, these are the logins, these are the dynamics behind the imperial mode of living. And this makes clear, and I want to underline this, imperial mode of living is not a moralizing category. It's not that we want to say you are bad because you do this and that. It's a category that really tries to understand how capitalism is inscribed into the everyday life. It's to understand political consequences, I come to this towards the end, are different from this. Yeah, I hope that you get this. It's not that and even less that I coming from Europe with an ecological footprint which is quite large, of course, only living in Europe, yeah, only having the public infrastructure, etc., that I come to the Philippines and say, so you should not do this and that and this. Yeah? This would be moralizing, and this is not at all my intention. So what are the driving forces in our book? The first, and this also helps if you want to do research in the with the concept of Imperial Mode of Living. The first, of course, is, if we think from a critical political economy perspective, capitalism means expansion, valorization, profit-making, and the commodification of labor in nature. So capitalism subsumes more and more and more the social and the ecological. This is kind of the logic of capitalism, the expansion of capitalism. It's about accumulation, but it also goes to the sphere of reproduction. The second driving force is, we use a term coined by Antonio Gramsci, an important thinker 100 years ago, who tried to understand with his concept of hegemony. Yeah? Usually in international relations, hegemony means the predominance of a state. United States hegemony, the question whether China is the next hegemon. In the 19th century, the British Empire was the hegemon, etc., etc. Gramsci has another understanding of hegemony. Gramsci said hegemony means domination by coercion, by power from above, but also by consent. That people accept domination, that people accept power relations, that many people think, okay, the inequality is fine because the rich might have good reasons to be rich, because they worked more or whatever. Or consent means that I find it okay how I live, how our societies, our cities are organized, etc., etc. So there is a material participation. The consent also means that we have a material participation in our societies. The third point is very important. Hierarchization. The Imperial Mode of Living bases on unequal social structures, unequal class structures, gendered structures, racialized structures. Yeah? So we have a division of labor which is highly unequal, also the international division of labor, and it reproduces it. So we need the dirty jobs, we need the racialized jobs, we need the cheap care work, mainly done by women, to reproduce the imperial mode of living. And the fourth aspect I already mentioned is externalization, is this constant reference to and elsewhere, the negative preconditions, the negative consequences that very, very often are externalized to the global south or to the peripheries within Europe, within the United States and elsewhere. We are not historians, Markus Wissen and I, but we try to understand. Hold on a second. We try to understand history, and we wrote 2 chapters of it, the 4th and the 5th chapter in the book, to go through history with the lens of the Imperial Mode of Living. And we argue that since colonialism, there was, of course, this reference. The essence of colonialism is to get the resources from the global south, from the colonies, to get the cheap labor and the products of the cheap labor. And at the beginning, in the 16th, 17th centuries, it was mainly the strategies by state and capital, and the dominant classes benefited from colonialism in the centers. It changed very much the south, as the colonies, much more than only the elites, but in the global north it was mainly a project by the elites. In the 19th century, the Imperial Mode of Living kind of diffused into society. If we think about sugar, sugar became a very important calorie supplier for workers. Yeah? And so throughout the Industrial Revolution, the fruits and others, they also became important in the global north. I skip one quote we can make available afterwards my presentation. This is a work by James Baldwin, you might know it, Sugar, a global history of sugar. And he shows quite explicitly how this is done. But due to time, I skip it and come to my next argument. You can read it afterwards if you want to get the power. Our argument is that the Imperial Mode of Living was generalized in the societies of the global north in the post-war period after the Second World War, which is called in social sciences Fordism. Fordism, also a term coming from Gramsci, means with Henry Ford, who was the first who produced cars with the assembly line before the cars were produced by kind of handcraft. So Ford introduced the assembly line, which came from the Chicago meat factories, and he said, so I use the assembly line for the car production. Fordism means mass production, mass consumption, and an enabling of the workers, because it was a high productivity, high wages, strong trade unions in many countries, that they became an explicit part of the Imperial Mode of Living. So my parents, born in the 30s and 40s of the last century, coming from a poor background, from a worker's background. My mother came from Poland, was a migrant. They experienced for the first time a material wealth which was unthinkable a generation before. This is kind of the generalization of the Imperial Mode of Living. And it created a well-being with all which was good. That they could afford to go to holidays, that they had this kind of mass consumption, they worked hard for it, etc., etc. But at the same time, it was also ecologically destructive. We know today that this overuse of resources, the emissions, everything exploded since the 1950s. Again, a quote by Baldwin, you can read it afterwards if you like, I skip it. And today, or since 2000, the Imperial Mode of Living is deepened in the global north. This has to do with an enormous expansion of access to products. Think of China, but also other countries, which became made in China is, I would say, I don't know this, but many products are made in China. This comes from the International Division of Labor since mid of the 90s and 2000. And also digitalization is an intensification of the Imperial Mode of Living, because digitalization, our cell phones are not at all clean. This is not clean technology. Digitalization is a very dirty industry, as we know, very resource intense, very energy intense. So it deepened the Imperial Mode of Living. Despite all environmental consciousness, it deepened in the global north, and it enhanced among the middle classes of the global south. The Imperial Mode of Living, if we think of many countries of the global south, that for many in the middle classes, it's also of course attractive, and they live the Imperial Mode of Living. It's always not one-to-one assimilated, and not just copied, but of course there are different forms how to live the Imperial Mode of Living in different countries, and it will be interesting to get your feedback, your thoughts on this in the discussion. I have the example of copper. I also will be fast on this, that we have enough time for discussion, but just to show you what is the Imperial Mode of Living when it comes to worldwide extraction and use of resources. So at the beginning of the so-called Great Acceleration in the post-war period, at the beginning of Fordism, as I said before, the worldwide production or extraction of copper was 2 million tons worldwide. It increased in the first 50 years until 2000 to 13 million. This is the phase we call, with Will Steffen, Great Acceleration. We can go into this if you're interested after. There is this famous graph, or look it up in the internet, the Great Acceleration, which is a famous concept in sustainability studies. But then again, despite all the knowledge about the problems of resource scarcity, the conflicts, etc., it doubled or almost doubled again until 2021, which is called the second great acceleration. And then only within 3 years, again, 55% increase. So this is copper. And why is this the case? It has to do, as I said, with the enormous rise of emerging economies. China is the main user of global resources, or the growth takes place there. But it's also digitalization, as I said, and it's the greening of the economy. All the attempts, for example, to electrify the car fleet or to build up renewable energies, this is very resource intense. I just give you here an incredible number. A megawatt of solar panel or wind turbine production of renewable energy is 5 tons of copper. Yeah. It's usual in Europe. I don't know how is it here in the Philippines. In Europe, if you hear usually in the public renewable energy, everything is fine. Everything is dematerialized. It's just wind turbines. It's just solar panels. But this is really, really resource intense. Yeah. So what does it mean? I come back to this at the very end when I make an argument for degrowth. Very provocative in countries of the global south, but I think in the global north we need to degrow. It's not enough just to innovate and to go for renewable energy, etc., etc. So this was about the Imperial Mode of Living. And now I come to my third consideration, which is how dominant political economic forces, but also alternative progressive forces try to deal with the current situation. This is an idea which is developed in the new book, as I said, which comes out soon. We argue that there are different projects, and please, we are here in an academic surrounding, but I hope that many people also come from other contexts. A project is not there. A project is a scientific abstraction. So we detect, it's an argument, we detect that there are bundles of actors, alliances of actors that organize around certain projects. So please have this in mind. It's an abstraction. We argue for this, and maybe you have another idea for a fourth project, our argument is just for our debate to condense these 3 projects. We call the first, and think about Trump and others, an authoritarian stabilization of the Imperial Mode of Living. It's an anti-ecological drill, baby drill, yeah, the famous Donald Trump sentence perspective. The second we call an ecological modernization of capitalism, or green capitalism, which tries to decarbonize our economies. It's very different from the first one. It takes seriously the ecological crisis, and I will go into this in a moment. And then the third one I will develop in my fourth consideration is what we call a solidary mode of living, which is pluriverse, decolonial, democratic, etc. The emblematic example for the first is the car with a combustion engine, the second is the electric car, and the third would be a very good public transport system. I start with the second. Ecological modernization, as I already said, means think about the European Green Deal, about the Inflation Reduction Act of the Biden government. I'm not familiar with the debates in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, but maybe you can give me examples afterwards. What are governmental initiatives here? It's the idea to decarbonize our societies, to get rid of fossil fuels and to produce the energy and others mainly through renewables. So the main idea is decarbonization. And this is important. Without any doubt, this is important. And if you're interested, those who are interested in state analysis or in environmental issues, we just published 3 weeks ago a paper in Nature Climate Change, a journal, on the decarbonization state. I sent it around to the commentators. but you can approach me afterwards and we can make it available, where we try to understand better what are the capacities of the state to act within the project of ecological modernization. We are quite skeptical, but it's a paper, it's only 6 pages, a short think piece in Nature Climate Change, but we work very, very long on it to understand the current constellation. So, it's important to decarbonize, but under current conditions, decarbonization has certain flaws. The first flaw is that it's growth-oriented. It's still green growth. And growth, we know this from many, many studies, means at the end of the day more resources and more emissions. Please think about my copper example before. So, despite all the attempts to decarbonize our societies, it's still a lot of use of resources, and at the end, there is no absolute decoupling possible. So, if there is growth, there is, according to tendency, more resource use and more emissions. This is one weakness of the green capitalist project. The second weakness is that it doesn't question the Imperial Mode of Living. Europe now speaks about resource partnerships, energy partnerships, hydrogen partnerships, but in fact, it's colonialism. It's to green Europe, but at the cost of other regions of the world. This is not at all questioned. Yeah? If you read the European Green Deal, it's, of course, the nice words are always partnerships, but in fact, it's reorganizing international exploitation and the international division of labor to green the European economy. And the third weakness of ecological modernization, of decarbonization, is that it is not a project that questions existing power relations. The social question is set aside. And this was the criticism, I don't know if you follow European politics. We had the Greens in the government in Germany, we had the Greens in the government in Austria, and they failed because they wanted to decarbonize our societies, but they didn't look at the social implications of decarbonization. And they didn't question power relations. And now when capital is not making profits with decarbonization, with renewable energy, it goes back to fossil fuels. It goes back to the production of cars with combustion engine, which is happening in Europe currently. So this is our point. And the link to the first project, the authoritarian anti-ecological stabilization, is that now the right-wing parties, AfD in Germany, FPÖ in Austria, Front National in France, they go precisely into this point to say the ecological modernization, the second project, is unjust. The rich can do what they want. They have their private jets, they have their huge ships. Jeff Bezos has his wedding in Venice, which was, I don't know if you followed. Hopefully not, but we couldn't avoid to follow what Jeff Bezos was doing in Venice. This is, of course, this is absurd. Or Elon Musk, who wants to fly to wherever. But then the government say we have to save the planet, but the government or the rich means the poor or the normal people should do it. This is the unjust, the unsocial aspect of the project of ecological modernization. It's very important to decarbonize, but if we don't question power relations, if we don't question the growth imperative, if we don't question global exploitation, it has its weakness and its limitations. And this is, the far right doesn't jump into the Imperial Mode of Living. The far right also wants the Imperial Mode of Living, but it jumps into this unjust perception and the unjust constellation of green capitalism in the global north. So in our new book, we quote studies who analyzed the discourses of the leaders of the far right parties. And it's precisely to tell the people, oh, those Greens, they want to cheat you. They are not integral. They just want that you cannot eat meat, that you cannot have your car. And the answer is the big steak, the Donald Trump steak, the big cars, etc. etc. I hope that you get my main idea, and we can also deepen it, and it's also again interesting to know how is it discussed here in the Philippines. I come to my last consideration. How to counter the Imperial Mode of Living. And again, it's in, I don't know here in the Philippines, but in Europe we have a very strong tendency in sustainability debates to individualize responsibility, that the consumer should save the world. You, the young people mainly, yeah? You should be vegan, vegetarian, no car, no fly, etc., etc. So this is kind of the part of the discourse. And we argue, no. We have to change our societies, we have to change the structures of society to enable a life which does not which does not need to refer to the Imperial Mode. Of course it's a choice. When I go from Vienna to Frankfurt, if I take a train or a plane, if I fly, I can easily take a train which needs 7 hours and I don't need to fly in an hour. This is a choice. But what we need in Europe is to get rid of the flights within Europe and to have a good train system. This is our argument. This is the enabling conditions. One thing is not to eat meat. Many of my students are vegan or vegetarians. I don't know how is it here. But the point is to close meat factories. This is the condition, because meat factories are ecologically, socially, the working conditions. Yeah, there are Romanian workers from Romania in the German meat factories, and ethically, when it comes to the animals themselves, this is not justifiable. This is not possible. So the point would be not to have this form of meat, and then we can rethink what is a good diet. I always say maybe we go back to the valuation of meat, to eat once a week meat. My parents, when they were young, meat was something very, very valuable, and it was clear that on Sunday there was meat, but not during the week. So this is a cultural shift, but the cultural shift needs to be complemented by the structural shift, which would be my argument, to close down the meat factories. I don't know how it resonates here in the Philippines. So I start with outlining some principles. What is the solidary mode of living? And then I come at a more concrete level to some proposals. And then I end my talk within the 50 minutes. One principle is, and also it's so difficult to think it globally, but this is my intention to be here and to learn from you, we need to think it globally. A good living for all is not a dolce vita for the few. It's not to have a good living for few people. Many in the global north, of course, the elites, and the rest is kind of self-responsible in not such a good living. So one very powerful principle, and if we think through it, and if we think politics through it, this is really powerful. A good living for all, which implies social ecological transformation as a just transformation. This implies, I would say, a profound questioning of an economy, of a capitalist economy, which is growth-oriented and which is profit-oriented. So the accumulation imperative, as I said, as one driving force of the Imperial Mode of Living, needs to be overcome. It's not that I'm against profits, but when profit-making is so obscene and it's so power-driven, yeah? Remember the inauguration of Donald Trump this January, when in the line, in the photo, the famous photo, behind him didn't stand his ministers. Usually the ministers are there. No, it was the tech brothers, the high-tech oligarchs who were supporting Trump. This is not possible. So to put really climate issues, justice issues first, and to refer to this principle of care. Care is not only the care work, but care means caring for ourselves, caring for the other, caring for society, and caring for nature. This is at an abstract level some of the principles. And now you might remember that I said the Imperial Mode of Living is close to a cultural political economy and also to political ecology. I don't know if you're familiar with this approach to sustainability studies. It's a critical approach. Political ecology has a very interesting, crucial concept, which is called provisioning system. Political ecology argues that our reproduction, our everyday reproduction, if we think this morning, what did you do this morning? Yeah. So you referred to mobility, you came to this room, you probably and hopefully already had a breakfast, so it is about nutrition, you have clothes, it's a provisioning that we have clothes, you lived in a house, you live in a house, it's housing, it's communication, etc., etc. So political ecology argues it makes sense to understand our society, our making, our everyday production from the perspective of provisioning systems. Housing, communication, food, etc., etc. I hope you get this. And if we have this perspective, and not to talk about capitalism as an abstract, of course this is capitalistically organized, but it gives us more flavor, more density to think through what is happening, what is wrong in our societies, and what can be changed. And we know so much how the provisioning systems can be changed. We know, now again coming from Europe, we know that a good diet should be meat-free or radically reduced with meat consumption. We know that our clothing does not make sense when it's based on cheap and fast fashion. Of course, so attractive because there's so much marketing behind it. But we know that it doesn't make sense. In Europe, there are estimates that a t-shirt, or I don't have the numbers, but more than half of the t-shirts bought are used twice or 3 times. It's just the thrill to buy a t-shirt for €3 and then not to use it anymore. We know that transport, to center mobility in automobility does not make sense. That we need good public transport systems, excellent public transport. I live in Vienna, and Vienna has a fantastic public transport, and I think it's no problem. I don't want to compare to Manila or I come from Cebu now. Of course, but there would be also, where are the initiatives to give people good mobility, safe, cheap, clean, fast, but the public mobility, and not to center it into cars. And I don't understand why to have a car in Vienna. Yeah, it's a status question. It's a question not to think about the world, etc., etc. So this is a bit the idea of the provisioning system, and I think it brings us really further. It brings us to the point to think in use values, not in the value of a product which is produced capitalistically to make profit, but what is really the use value of mobility, and not per se of the car. Again, coming from Europe, a good living has to do with a strong public sector. I know this Vienna also there is corruption in Vienna. You might know that Vienna is a progressive city, luckily, yeah? But it's also, of course, the Social Democrats are so long in power, you cannot avoid that there is corruption, etc. But Vienna is a very well-functioning city because it has has a strong public sector. Yes, that many things were not privatized. The higher education system is public. I'm happy here to be at UP, and that the health system is public. Many things are public, and this makes the society well. What we need for a different form of well-being are spaces for deliberation. I would argue, and we argue in the new book, we should not buy the argument, which is very strong in Europe, I don't know how is it here, maybe the authoritarian governments can solve the ecological problem more easily, the ecological question. There is a tendency to say, in China, look in China, they say, the government, the party says we have to do this and that, and it works, electric cars. Yeah. And I would argue, no, this is the tendency of authoritarianism, is reducing spaces of deliberation, is reducing to bring in interests and different perspectives, and my argument would be we need these spaces of deliberation which are under menace when it comes to authoritarian governments. And the final point is that we need conflicts. Usually the conflicts are imposed from the powerful, from above, when it comes to dams, when it comes, now probably the examples in the Philippines, the large-scale infrastructure projects, and then the resistance or the answers from below are causing conflicts. And I think these emblematic conflicts are very important. We had this, and now in Vienna there's a conflict, there's a project to build another tunnel beneath the Danube River, arguing we need a new tunnel because we have too much car traffic. Yeah? Everybody knows that if you build a new highway, if you build a new tunnel, it creates more transport. We know this from our studies, but the argument is always we can make the transport more easy if we have more highways, if we have more tunnels. And this is a very, very important conflict in Austria to show we don't need new highways, we don't need new tunnels, we need better public transport. And maybe in Manila, yeah, I'm not familiar with it, maybe also it's a nice thought and a nice initiative to say we need a Manila with a fantastic public transport system and with liberated from the dominance of cars. Maybe in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, to start thinking, what does it mean? Because the car-centered mobility is highly unequal. Who can afford a car? Which kind of car? Who uses the space, etc., etc. I don't want to criticize anybody here in the room, individually, please. It's just, it's a political argument. So my last arguments, my last points. I said at the beginning, a very vibrant debate in Europe is this of degrowth. Here in the Global South it's more on decoloniality, post-development, and there are many debates which try to link it. I would argue for a degrowth in a sense that it's not a crisis. Degrowth does not mean it's good when we have a negative gross national product, when there is no growth. This means usually a crisis, and this is usually negative for the masses. And the rich, they save themselves, they get the money from the state in the crisis, but the masses not. Degrowth is a political project to create well-being differently and to overcome the capitalist growth imperative. We talked about Indonesia, and this when we came here. The nickel production in Indonesia makes now Indonesia as the miracle, yeah? the economic miracle. But what does it mean concretely for the people? For the regions, for the rivers, for nature, that now Indonesia says we are the top producer of nickel. So this is degrowth in the sense we don't need the development imperative in Indonesia at any cost, and because of course it serves certain interests, transnational capital, Indonesian capital, etc., etc. This is the idea of degrowth. It's not to say, good that there's a crisis, but there is to overcome this imperative of growth, growth, growth. Yeah? And to be more concretely, if we liberate Vienna from cars and to double public the infrastructure, or Austria, Europe, we double the infrastructure for public transport, this would mean at the beginning a lot of investment. But then in the midterm, this would mean degrowth. This would mean not to have any longer the production and the profits of cars, and then we come to many problems. What does it mean for the workers? What does it mean for the state taxes, etc., etc.? But you should be serious with the aim that we need a Europe liberated by the dominance of cars, which means to build a good train system, a good bus system, etc., etc. And my final thought, I don't know how it resonates here, I'm speaking for the first time about it, it's the last 6 pages in the new book. We call it transformative cells. The idea comes from uneasiness of many what we could call theories of change. A theory of change means who is really pushing social change, and then it comes of course to social movements, to civil society NGOs, to progressive political parties or politicians, to progressive politics of the state, etc., etc. Business, green business, social, business, etc. And this is important. We don't reject this. This is important. But we want to add one perspective when it comes to a theory of change. We argue that we often, in progressive debates, we underestimate that within the organizations, within UP Diliman, University of Vienna, within a company, within a state apparatus, a ministry, within whatever, there are groups, there are people who want more, who want to change something, who are more progressive, who really strive for social ecological change. And those people should encourage and empower themselves to change, to go further. I hope that you get. I am a member of the sustainability board of the University of Vienna, and we really try to push the University of Vienna's institutions organization towards social ecological transformation. For example, that the kitchens of the university become meat-free. Many students already want it. So this is now the institutional answer to this, to say, yeah, we don't need meat. If people want to eat meat, the schnitzel, the famous schnitzel, they can do it anyway in the evening if you're there. But lunch should be healthy, cheap, and meat-free. So this is our, let's say, transformative step. If you think in schools, yeah, when I talk to teachers, when I invite them to talks, and they are so frustrated because the teaching load is so high, it's so hard work, etc. But then you always detect some teachers who want more, who really want to educate people in a different way, critically, etc., etc. And this would also be, from our perspective, a transformative step. I hope that you get this idea. So the last slides, as I said, this is the transformative step. A colleague of mine did it. Yeah. Here are some publications. We will send it around, and you can have a look. And this is now the QR code, if you like, for the book. Thank you for your attention.
Maraming salamat po, Professor Uli. So that was a very insightful discussion. There are still a lot of things to unpack, but one thing that I do want to highlight is that the very idea of having cars, and the idea that when we are in capitalism, we always think about us as the individual in that structure, but we need to think that we as individuals are not separate from one another. Us within the structure of capitalism are struggling as a collective. We are sharing these struggles, we are sharing this particular predicament. So therefore, our possible answers, our possible resolutions should also be collective as well. And I think the idea of provision structures or provision systems, it's actually one of the major arguments of people in the Philippines why they buy cars actually. And not to point out people, but it's actually one of the hot topics within the university right now, that it's becoming very car-centric. So, and again, the argument would circle back to there is a very, very bad public transportation system in the Philippines. And I think the burden is not on us, but the burden is with the government itself. Okay. So, now, at this part of the program, to import us with significant reflections on the Filipino situation, we have two reactors who have been vocal critics of capitalism and the subjugation of the marginalized within and outside the Philippines. Now, may we first welcome our first reactor, the coordinator of 11-11-11 Asia, Ma'am Frances Lo.
Magandang umaga ho sa lahat. Good morning, and thank you for the enlightening discussion, Professor Brand. Thank you to the organizers, the UP Third World Studies Center and the colleagues at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for this invitation. I had a brief scare there when Jules said that we are vocal critics of capitalism. But yes, we have heard from Professor Brand how the current capitalist system has entrenched itself globally, and we can certainly feel its impacts here in the country. And while true that we already know its roots and its evolution, it is still useful to hear further exploration on this. And I think what Professor Brand just shared with us gives us some more thoughts to ponder, no, on how it translates in the Philippines. Which is why I believe that this discussion on the Imperial Mode of Living is a good addition to our theoretical and practical handles in looking at the systemic issues that confront us. When I was listening to the presentation, what first crossed my mind was how this could be used in addressing the so-called crisis that we have been experiencing. We can no longer look at the different crises we have, economic, social, political, ecological, as individual crisis as it is, but it is part of a system that exacerbates and amplifies each other. To illustrate, we have seen how capitalism was able to weather its own internal crisis by shape-shifting, if you will, through consolidation and concentration. For example, corporations, and we see it here in the Philippines, seek to become monopolies or oligopolies through mergers and acquisitions. Private holding firms go into buying and selling off parts at the expense of delivery of services. They do this at the back of the gig economy and precarious labor, where global supply chains and outsourcing are commonplace, while wages stagnate. So it's no wonder that even at the time of the recent pandemic, wealth inequality and wealth concentration in the Philippines heightened. We also heard from Professor Brand the impacts of the imperial mode of living on the environment and nature as we confront climate change. Just to give an example, Professor Brand mentioned about Indonesia and the nickel, its nickel contribution to the global supply chain. In the Philippines, there is talk about critical minerals and how we will contribute to this whole decarbonization and renewable energy spread. But the question remains, critical to who and who owns those critical minerals. So, I will no longer go deep on that because that was discussed extensively by Professor Brand. But what I was going to add is that with this externalization of costs, meaning land grabbing, resource grabbing, displacement of communities, indigenous peoples no longer having access to their ancestral domain, we have become what is called the sacrifice zones. We are part of the necessary trade-off, so to speak, of this whole debate on where are we going from here. The so-called necessary trade-off to maintain the imperial mode of living in the global north and also in capitalist centers in the global south, where the elites continue to mimic the same growth of their counterparts in the global north, remain a perennial problem. But what I would like to contribute to the discussion is that knowing that this is going to take place in UP and students are here, is that, and I see in the room majority are so-called digital natives. I am not. And so I would like to discuss the issue, or at least contribute on how we will use the imperial mode of living as a theoretical handle when we talk about digital justice or digital democracy. I would like us to collectively look at this and find solutions and alternatives to this increasingly unequal and inequitable situation. We all are part of social networking platforms, whether intentionally or not. We are there. And we are there for different reasons, but I think the most common is for connection or social interaction. But this whole free platform that we are using, whether to engage our families, friends, classmates, and the public seem at the beginning and at the surface level innocuous. However, as these platforms evolve, we find ourselves asking, why are we in this again? When, speaking for myself, I could no longer recognize what it was when I joined Facebook, for example, many months ago, and how toxic it has become. And so, I posit that it is in the nature of these platforms to find ways to profit. And recall that when these platforms were conceived, they were running on investments from venture capitalists who find value in startups. Amazon, for example, only started to earn after 6 years from its inception. Facebook for less than that. But how did they start to flip the page and earn profits for the investors? And so I enter the new raw material, which is data. It is currently the foundation of the modern economy. In 2019, UNCTAD predicted that businesses that use big data will dominate the global economy by as much as 70%. And so we are here now, users as consumers and users as labor. Subscribers easily provide their data for entry to these platforms. And with each like, hovering over a page for more than 5 seconds, adding your location and tagging your friends, all these are aggregated by these platforms to be packaged and sold to corporations and consumed by advertisers. In the process of making these platforms enticing to gain more subscribers, their back-end support are either housed overseas or completely run by machines. And this is where the nature of capitalism enters. No, there has to be accumulation and oppression there somewhere. And this so-called machine intelligence is their new product, harvested from the data we voluntarily provide them. These platforms become consolidators of data that enable them to translate these bits into behavior prediction. So we have become both the producer and the consumer. UNCTAD also came out with its digital economy report in 2021, where it showed a data divide between countries of the global south and the global north. The ability to own, control, and harness data resources into valuable intelligence and translate the same into opportunities for development is skewed in favor of the global north. It said in that report that only 10 economies account for 90% of all global patents and 70% of all exports directly associated with advanced digital production technologies, including AI, big data analytics, cloud computing, Internet of Things, advanced robotics, and additive manufacturing. In an economy where digital intelligence is even more central to production, countries and communities of the global south that lack data processing and AI capabilities will be unable to optimize their data resources. And so, in this whole chain, where are we as users and as consumers? And so we are forced to relinquish control of our own data, extracted and locked up within AI systems of transnational capital, and we have very limited means to fair share of the benefits. This results, UNCTAD further said that this results in gross economic unfairness in the global digital economy and algorithmic coloniality. This has many names now: digital capitalism, surveillance capitalism, platform capitalism, to name a few. I'd just like to mention, Elon Musk was mentioned earlier, and this whole tech bro macracy that they're trying to. I'd just like to connect it to the whole issue of social ecological crisis, no? Where one data center that hosts the Facebook data center, there are water issues now in that community, and it's in the States. And so you can imagine when they will try to use Global South, what that would entail given our scarce resources now. And so, given the whole setup of this digital capitalism, we see how this inequity is worsened by the aggressive push for cross-border data flows in the global economy. You mentioned about the trade agreements, and this benefit very few powerful countries whose corporations enclose data and assert de facto ownership over them. You can see this in, for example, the EU-Philippines Free Trade Agreement that's being talked about, the whole discussion of the framework agreement with the United States, etc. And thus, it asserts the hegemony of capitalism. In the case of these social media platforms, though, domination is not in your face, and this I would like to further engage the digital natives. And I quote from the book of Professor Brand, and this was taken from Gramsci, when domination does not use naked force, discipline and oppression of the populace to maintain itself, but indeed draws on the wishes and desires of the people who use these platforms, it becomes a part of individual identity, shapes it, and thereby becomes all the more effective. Domination then is no longer merely external to individual subjects. Instead, it employs the very mechanisms these individual acts upon themselves and thus displays its effectiveness precisely in the fact that it is not felt as domination. So, what are our alternatives? I am in Facebook, but I'm not in Facebook, kind of. So that's why, but that's like a selective, Professor Brand mentioned about the personal changes that we can do, but in the end it is a systemic problem. So you heard about the solidarity mode of living. I would like to think that the whole discourse on just transition, whether it's in energy, on the other types of just transition that is being discussed now within the movements, is part of that. It's integrated. However, many of the proposals of the social movements now on just transition has been captured, and this is the story, this is a frequent story that we hear, co-opted by those that are in the decision-making centers. So co-opting this has diminished its value, I believe, and that we should reclaim it. One aspect of the just energy transition, for example, talks about principles on how we can implement these alternatives. And I get one of the distinct things that I find useful now when we talk about solidarity mode of living is the building of democratic and participatory ways of co-creating solutions. Colonial, non-racist, gender inclusive. We can start with that by ensuring that we are creating a solution that eliminates externalizing and othering the costs and trade-offs without need for exploiting other people. We have had several openings, but unfortunately these were maximized by simplistic solutions of right-wing ultranationalist groups that exploit and that exploit the fears and insecurities of the people rather than their strength and inherent value for solidarity. And so our urgent task then is to talk about this digital democracy, digital justice as digital natives, and to find our solutions. We need to internationalize these struggles and cobble together alternatives collectively, debate on them, question them, struggle for them, but let's do it fast and decisive. In the immediate, we need effective social movements to counter narratives of authoritarians and those who believe that fixes are the way to go. Thank you.
Maraming salamat po, Ma'am Frances. And before we proceed, para po dun sa mga nasa may labas, we now have available seats inside. So if you want to move forward, pwede naman po natin i-occupy yan. And gusto ko yung pinalitan ni Ma'am Frances on the idea of how us as digital natives actually use online spaces, and how within these online spaces we actually become consumers and producers at the same time. And I think the one thing that we need to realize is that first, that we are consumers and producers. And we don't need to rely on that particular system. We need to think ways on how to subvert that particular reality. So anyway. Now, as we go on, may we call on our second reactor, who is the current director of the UP Center for International Studies, Professor Ramon Guillermo.
Magandang umaga. Salamat sa Cerebral Studies Center, salamat sa Rosa, Luxemburg, Stiftung. Thanks for the very engaging lecture earlier, Professor Brand. And nung undergrad kami ni Francis, mga anti-capitalist na mga dibak. So, what else? So let me talk about. Tomorrow we'll also be having another kind of continuation of Professor Brand's lectures. I think it will be about their new book, Capitalism at its Limits. And we'll be having it there at the Center for International Studies in a smaller classroom. So you have to come first so that you can have a seat, as well as 10 a.m., starting 10 a.m. tomorrow at the Bentham Hall. So I hope to see some of you there, because I think that's the continuation of the argument, and that's a kind of deepening of the argument that he made this morning. Now, I'd like to, I think I encountered a bit of this imperial mode of living when I was studying German, and I had a German teacher. And then he was explaining the concept of Urlaub, right? And then we're saying, hold on, we can easily translate that into our life. That's vacation, that's a kind of vacation. And we go to our grandparents, sometimes in the weekend. We have some kinds of holidays spread throughout the year. We have vacations, and then we go on that kind of, we have some relaxing time. But our teacher, our German teacher, das ist ja kein Urlaub, he would say. That's not Urlaub. Because Urlaub is something like a 1 or 2 paid vacation for the working classes in Germany, where they go to other countries, other places, not Germany. So they really have this kind of idea of the Urlaub, where you really leave your job and it's paid, and then you can have a nice vacation elsewhere. And that we actually don't have that kind. It's not in our law to have any kind of Urlaub in the Philippines. So that I thought we can't translate, therefore, Urlaub into bakasyon, because they're not the same. And they're not the same. So that is the imperial mode of living. And of course, since we come not from Europe, and we don't, when Professor Brand says here, he's actually not talking about here. This place is the elsewhere. The Philippines is the elsewhere in his book, where all of these ecological crises is externalized. So he's been talking about where does Europe externalize the negative effects of this kind of imperial mode of living. It's externalized in the global south. It's externalized in places like the Philippines. So we have to talk about the Philippines. We have a former colony, arguably still a neo-colonial colony. So if we're going to look at a kind of parallel to the idea of imperial mode of living in Europe and in the United States, for example, we might say that we have a neo-colonial mode of living, and we're wondering why it is so persistent. Now, if Professor Brand is wondering why is the imperial mode of living so persistent, why can't we change it? When we also have to think here, where we are, living in a neo-colonial or neo-feudal mode of living. Why? Why is it so persistent? Why can't we change it? And why haven't we changed it? But I think it's not appropriate to say mode of living in our case. Because is this really life? Is this really living for the great majority of Filipinos? I think I would prefer in our case, it's the neo-colonial struggle for existence. It's not the imperial mode of living, but the neo-colonial struggle to just survive every day. Right? Do you agree with that? I think that's our parallel idea. It's a neo-colonial daily struggle for existence. And the great majority of Filipinos really has a sense of this kind of situation. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have any imperial mode of living in the Philippines. We do. And the most controversial aspect of this imperial mode of living happening now are the neo-Nepo babies, right? Nepo babies. They are living the life. They are living, maybe not even just as ordinary imperial mode of living in Europe, but way above and beyond that. And we were talking to Francis earlier, and Francis said that many of these young people, the Nepo babies, also their parents are involved in this, of course. One Nepo baby even called her parent, thanked her dad, because he's the ATM that's always there. You know, the ATM. My dad, I'd like to thank him for being the ATM that's always there. So Francis said, no, many of these young people, they're influencers, right? And when they're influencers on social media, I think they're not just flaunting their wealth, right? Of course, they're showing that this kind of wealth is desirable, right? Desirable for you guys. At the same time, that this wealth is exclusive. Just like how the imperial mode of living plays itself out in Europe. This is a very desirable way of life, but it's exclusive. It's not for everyone. And as you know, they got their money from something that makes us suffer and live under a neo-colonial struggle for existence, the flooding projects. So they got their billions. They corrupted billions of pesos for the flood control projects and got billions, these contractors. Supposedly, this money would be used so that, people would have a better transport, system, they would be bothered so much by the storms and the typhoons that always come, right? But they got the money. They didn't put up, these flood control projects. And they used it to buy, and this is so close to what Professor Brand is talking about, luxury cars, many luxury cars. So one family, they bought 40 luxury cars, SUVs, as you also wrote in your book, kind of gold standard, many SUVs, and I think estimated cost of all those luxury cars for one family was around 700 million pesos, almost $1 billion pesos for these cars. So you can see that it's so ironic, It's so ironic that you have this imperial mode of living, people buying so many cars, but it's all on the back of the public. It's all stolen from the public. So that the great majority of us, we live in a neo-colonial struggle for survival, right? And we don't even live. It's not even living that we have in this case. And also to avoid traffic, one of our politicians is using our campus as a helicopter landing pad. So it's even more extreme, like those guys, they buy their SUVs, they buy their Rolls Royces, right? But, the Rolls Royces really don't get you there faster because of the traffic. So why not use helicopters, right? Paid for by the people's taxes, right? So that's, on the one hand, you have this, in the elsewhere of Europe, you have people who live that kind of imperial mode of living. At the same time, the masses they live in this neo-colonial struggle for survival. And if you also look to the situations of universities, I would say that there's also an academic imperial mode of living, and there's the neo-colonial academic mode of living. And I think that's quite easy to see in, for example, the university rankings, right? If you look at the university rankings, all of the imperial universities at the very top of these rankings, and then you have the neo-colonial university trying to survive, trying to get up the rankings, struggling, etc. But as you can see, it's hard for academics living in our context to compete at that level. We are in terms of teaching loads, in terms of other loads, and in terms of funding support, grants, publishing opportunities. It's much less in the global south than in the global north. So you also need to see this great imbalance in terms of the academic life that the academics experience and live and try to survive on our salaries in our institutions in the Philippines as compared with those living in the imperial centers. So there's also this imbalance, and this imbalance is very widely circulated and advertised in these so-called university world rankings, right? That you have these imperial universities, imperial centers of knowledge production, and UP itself was founded by our former colonizer, the United States, to produce subaltern intellectuals, to produce intellectuals who serve the continuing needs of the colonial regime. That's why up to today, there is extreme academic and intellectual dependency here. Extreme, in the Philippines, extreme intellectual academic dependency. That is, we are so closely tied to the United States in terms of our academic life that we don't seem to have our own direction, our own thinkers, our own discourses about our different fields that we are taking up. So I think I have to thank Professor Regleto Imbong for also putting us in contact. Professor Imbong from UP Cebu works in the area of decolonizing academic work in the global south. And I think maybe Professor Brand can also have a sense of this neo-colonial intellectual life that we have in the Philippines. If he looks at the perfect English of our students and our professors here, and also the broken English of the great masses of the Filipinos. This is the most striking aspect of Filipino intellectual dependency. And this was already written about by Renato Constantino, the great Filipino historian, who also had his book, and maybe you can buy his book, the 50th year edition was just released recently. So Constantino says that if you want to look at the intellectual dependency of Filipinos, look at their language, right? English, and that ties you up closely with the United States and with the global north. And you're unable now to assert your independence. Now, one aspect of Philippine imperial mode of living is our labor export policy, right? Because the imperial mode of living, as Professor Brand said, is not confined to the elites of the global north. It is a generalized way of living. And of course, many of you will go abroad because we have a policy of labor export, right? You're good at English, you can go abroad anytime and get a job abroad, right? So Filipinos are known for this because of our labor export policy. Filipino nurses, Filipino caregivers, etc. Are exported hundreds and hundreds, thousands every year, thousands and thousands every year. And they do this kind of externalized labor within the imperial centers of the world. So one of my best friends in elementary, we have the same name, Ramon. He was a nurse and he migrated to the US. And if I look at his Facebook, which Francis mentioned. He's always posting stuff about his vacations in the red light districts of Bangkok, right? Always posting pictures of himself playing golf, right? He has a hard life as a nurse, definitely, in the United States. But when he gets his vacation, maybe one can call it an urlaub, he really spends a lot and lives his life as he wanted his life to be. Playing golf and going to red light districts, enjoying everything that he can enjoy with the money that he earns from being a migrant Filipino abroad, but living a very difficult life as a worker, right? So this is how the imperial mode of living also manifests itself among Filipinos. That many of us desire this, and the state supports this and doesn't give a job and makes us suffer under a neo-colonial struggle for life in the Philippines, right? So how to struggle, right? So there are many kinds of struggle that Filipinos are doing. And I think that, as Lenin said, right? The Philippines is still part of the weakest link of capitalism. That is, that if we can have a collective social movement and revolutionary process in countries like the Philippines, then we can participate in breaking these weakest links of capitalism on a global scale. I think that's the role of countries like the Philippines. But in doing these kinds of revolutionary contestations, of course, we face all kinds of repression and state brutality. And I recommend this film, Anipato, on Jonas Burgos, an activist who was disappeared by the military. It won a big prize as the best film, I think last week. And it's about contesting he was working among peasants, contesting the neoliberal regime, and how the Philippine state brutally represses such activism. Yeah, so we have to look at all of these histories and stories that we have. But so I think that's all I have to say about the imperial mode of living. But I was talking about not the here of Europe, but the elsewhere. The elsewhere where we are. And here we are. This is where we can make a difference. Thank you.
Maraming salamat po, Sir Bowen. Bilang dating philo major na principal din sa idea na what do we even mean by living? It's a very semantic question. I like it. And so, at this juncture, we are now proceeding with our open forum. So, kung makikita po natin, we have 2 mic stands at the both ends of the so you can proceed there. And then for every person that will be asking a question, we will be giving out either a notebook or a board game provided by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. So, ayan. Pila lang po kayo, then we will recognize you. So, sir, pabanggit na lang po ng name, affiliation, and then po yung tanong, and to visit.
Hello. My name is Andoy Evangelista from the Sociology Department. I'd like to take off from the moment to speak from the elsewhere of Europe. You mentioned that the concept of imperial mode of living is a structural conception. And in that structuralist conception, how essential or how enduring is the relationship it posits between colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism? Because this question comes from a recognition that the colonial powers did not just use capitalist tools to impose coloniality in the South. I mean, in the Philippines, for example, in South America, for example, colonial powers instrumentalized existing political economies like patronage and feudalism to impose and entrench their powers in these occupied territories. Because my question is, if the concept sort of like structurally links colonialism and capitalism, then the question becomes, how much does the concept externalizes other forms of political economies that even historically colonialism has used to impose its powers? Because my concern is that if the concept essentializes the relationship between capitalism and colonialism. It glosses over other political economies that have been internally instrumentalized by colonialism. And the danger there is to further reify the notion that, well, the West is civilized because they're capitalists and the rest is externalized as backward political economies like feudalism or patronage or even slavery. So my question is that, conceptually, how much does it externalize other forms of political economies that historically colonialism has actually used internal to itself, other than capitalism?
Wow, fantastic. Thank you very much. I come back to your point, which is thrilling, and I would like to go, of course, briefly to Francis and Mohammed's or Ramon's comments. Thrilling, really. Francis, I think this is a major point. We have to say, also for Markus Wissen, we are not experts on digitalization. For me, also at the individual level, I started to use a cell phone 3 years ago. I resisted always to use the cell phone, and because I didn't want it, and I had a good living, a good life, yeah, without cell phone. But then at one point I decided to have one, and yeah, it's not so strong, the book. But 3 remarks on this. One is, as a concrete initiative, I found it interesting when Musk was buying X, that the University of Vienna and many others, and also the many intellectuals with a far reach on Twitter and X, left it. I don't know how is it here in the Philippines. So X is not any longer important in Austria. And it was a cultural movement. It was, of course, you cannot leave it individually because these are networks. But it was really important, and the University of Vienna decided 2 years ago, we leave X, we use Blue Sky, for example. So this is the one thing. The other, when it comes to digitalization, and which really strikes me, how to make visible at the everyday level the use of resources and energy when we use this. I was socialized ecologically in the 80s and 90s, and in the 80s it was, I don't know here, but in Germany, to switch off the light when you leave the room. This was important. Of course, when we think about energy use, it's nothing. But culturally, it made me sensitive that this has to do something with me, that it's important to switch off the light when we don't use the light. So what would it mean as a cultural movement to say, if I go for a machine, if I want to look something up, I go directly to Wikipedia, because Wikipedia probably uses less than 1% of the energy that Google uses, because Wikipedia is already reused. So what are the forms of I cannot say it here because I'm not a specialist, but this would be for me beside detoxing, etc., etc. The everyday uses we want advantages, but we want to be sensitive. And the third thing, then it comes to the structure level. When this is our new public, and if I want to go to the public, the first thing I get is advertising, is marketing, because the platforms are profit-driven. What we need is to socialize them. They cannot be private. They need to be public. So where is the move, where are the initiatives, the global initiatives, to devalorize the capital of the platforms, and where are the initiatives to make them public? The ownership of the platforms need to be public, because this is our public. This is our democracy. Yeah. So just a thought, but I think these are the venues to go to. One final thought. I read an interview which I found interesting. A specialist, I'm not a specialist, a specialist argued the internet will implode within a few years, because due to AI, the credibility of the internet will implode. So we will ask ourselves in 5 years, is this reality, or is it, already we ask us hopefully, but is this what we see as a photo, as a message, is this true or not? I found it, I have to think through, and we should discuss it, but it's a good thought to say, AI will kind of take all the credibility from the use of the internet. So we will might be
go back to newspapers. Of course, we will then read digitally, to newspapers where we can believe that the journalists, they do a hard job to inform us objectively about what is happening, and not any longer than. I will brief because there are other questions. One point, thank you, this is really also great. I want to underline the Urlaub. The Imperial Mode of Living is, and this is the ambiguity, it's also a result of struggles. It's a result of worker struggles and material participation. Of course, the Urlaub was mainly invented by the Nazis, yeah? But it is also the collective organization of trade unions, of corporatism, that people have a paid leave is a result of struggles. So we have to understand this, because this it's not so easy to say here's the Imperial Mode of Living, here's us, but it's precisely the struggles. The second, yes, very, very strong struggles for existence and to survive the everyday. My point would be, but as a question, without any arrogance and coming from outside, what are, when it comes to alternatives, and when people want to and should leave the everyday struggle for existence, is the mode to leave the everyday struggle for existence to enter the Imperial Mode of Living? Or to organize the society differently? To have other forms of living well, living beyond the existence, but not individually as the Imperial Mode of Living? It's an open question, I don't have an answer. But this, how does it mean if I live here and I create communities, and I have collective work, I live together, and then I have a better life. But now the proposal and the attractiveness is, if you want to go beyond survival, you enter the Imperial Mode of Living. Wage labor, individualized, competence, etc., etc. The flood control, yeah, this is just an awful example. Maybe my political answer to many of your questions, also of your question, would be, Imperial Mode of Living is not only to criticize the rich, I think this is clear, but we should start with eat the rich, to criticize richness. And what I find really interesting, I don't know if you're familiar with the studies from Lucas Chancel, he works with Thomas Piketty, the famous inequality research, and Chancel shows the ecological inequality. He shows the ecological footprint of the rich and the super rich. And I think politicizing, and this is your example with the money which comes in, of course the Imperial Mode of Living in Europe is very general, but also in Europe we have a lot of inequality, and I think currently there's an interesting moment because the wealth grew so much in the last year, during Corona, during the last years, the Oxfam studies on equality, and we can use it, and I would think one politicization is to have this vertical perspective and to say the rich are really the main problem. As now Jan van Aken, the head of the left party in Germany, always says, I don't like billionaires. He starts his speech, he starts his public statements, I don't like billionaires. So to politicize this. And then the final point from the comrade colleague. Yes, I have to think through it. My background is Latin America. I would say yes, it's a danger to not to consider, if I got your point right, not to consider really the political economy of alternatives, and that they were instrumentalized historically. But I would argue, this is why I mentioned Latin America, in Latin America a lot of hope is not to romanticize the very concrete, let's say, less capitalist alternatives in communities, but to strengthen them. I can imagine that your struggle is exactly this. There are so many alternatives, local alternatives, community alternatives in the cities, in the countryside, and they were always historically instrumentalized. But to strengthen them as alternatives, I hope that you get the point. I think, yeah, this is my experience I get always from Latin America. There's so much going on, there's so much resistance, there's so much alternatives, and we should look at them despite the fact that they were always instrumentalized. Slave labor, etc., etc.
Thank you, Professor Brand. Francis, Sir Bowman. Okay na po kayo, sir. Okay na po kayo, sir Andrew.
Just to clarify, my point was not about alternatives. My point was other exploitative political economies other than capitalism has been instrumentalized by colonization to further entrench their power. Historically, in the Philippines, for example, patronage and feudalism has been entrenched so that Spain and the United States can entrench its power in the Philippines. Now, in the conceptualization of the Imperial Mode of Living, it posits a relationship between imperialism and capitalism. My concern is that if that relationship is essentialized, then that structuralist conception overlooks other exploitative political economies that are also internal to colonization. That's my point.
I agree, and I see the danger, and I think through it, yeah, it's a very strong point. There's so many other questions.
Okay po. So, thank you po. So, we will be entertaining questions from this side now. So, sir.
Professor Brand and Bommel already mentioned about the cycles of crisis, that capitalism has had in Asia. We've felt that during the Asian financial crisis. We thought it was going to be something that's going to alter the course of our economies, but then the IMF came and became the saviors and changed the whole narrative, right? So if we are going to focus just on the Philippines, for example, here capitalism takes a different form. Of course, in a general sense, externalizing costs, privatizing profit, but socializing losses. That has been the common thread across the different countries where capitalism is the dominant system. But maybe just for us to collectively think about how we do the reverse, socializing not just the means of production, but also the mode of living that Bowman and Professor Brand mentioned. I think we can focus there, not necessarily to change, because it's a systemic and a global systemic order, but to chip off little by little here in the Philippines. I think their movements, student movement is also part of it, has a big contribution. Because then the new international economic order takes longer. The consensus building is difficult across the regions. The neoliberals easily got that through the Washington Consensus, right, in the early 80s and 90s. But then, for us who are trying to shift this, to change, reform, whatever you want to call it, consensus is quite difficult. And so I think we can build on these incremental changes that we do in our everyday lives, but also here in the Philippines. How do we do it in a systematic and systemic way?
Maraming salamat. Okay. So, for our next question, probably this will be our last since may tatlo nang nakatayo. So, we will start with you po. Or meron pang gustong, last four. Okay. So, we'll start with this and then we'll end there. So, this one.
Okay. Hi, I'm Dara Janelle Ioy. I'm a graduate student from the Department of Political Science, and I am taking a developmental governance class under Dr. Marivic Nahiza. So thank you so much, Dr. Brand, for this very important work, and that sought to capture how the present ecological crisis is entrenched in the system. So I actually did a bit of a skim in your material, and I agree with your point that individuals are constrained by the persistent imperial mode of living And I like how you fleshed it out in your dialectic, and it comes in 3 tiers. Material, where cheap consumer goods consumed by the capitalist centers are produced in the peripheries. Subjective, the imperial mode of living shapes identities and preferences, which establishes imperial connections and reinforces social and class structures. And finally, political, which pertains to the fact that persistent modes of living reinforces labor relations that, despite the consciousness of its ecological implications, are imbued in material interests. That is, car workers can't help but turn a blind eye and participate in the production of cars because this work gives them food on the table. So, in this very bleak realization, I wonder if you and the panel have any insights on the role of the state in becoming a driver for change, especially in facilitating structural transformation. To be sure, to what extent should the state be involved in providing more freedoms for its constituencies and eventually emancipate individuals from the imperial mode of living? Thank you.
Before po natin sagutin, in the interest of time, let's collect all the questions. So, kindly state your name, affiliation, and question for the remaining 3 items.
Hi. Wow. My name is Pao Chingming. I'm from the Department of History. And my question is something, well, it's kind of more complicated, but I'm also welcoming, because of how complicated it is, or because of how hard to answer it is, I'm open to just like, I guess like a more personal or like a vaguer, I'm not saying not helpful or unhelpful, but you know, like not concrete, not definite answer, you know? So my question is, you know, you talk about the imperial mode of living, and it's quite clear that, as Prof. Mohammed mentioned earlier, like a lot of people, especially in the first world, live double lives, you know? Like workers are exploited, like that's an objective fact, like capital, but at the same time, because of their positionalities, because they do benefit from super profits extracted from the third world, from the Philippines, from India, from Indonesia, and all these other countries. Like how do we build, or like how do you think, as someone from the first world, like we can't answer. For us, the question is much more straightforward. You know, here it's destroy imperialism, destroy feudalism, and you know, it's something we can all unite around. Even the middle classes can, even the national bourgeoisie, you know, the local manufacturing class can agree with that. But in the first world, like how do you like balance the messaging? How do you balance the praxis? Because you know, with Palestine also, it's something that's been radicalizing a lot of first worlders and has been plunging a lot of them into this kind of what do you call it, like nihilism, right? Like I see some like self-labeled Maoists in the US and elsewhere. They've come up with this portmanteau, which is very amusing. It's very silly. It's called Treatler or Treatlerite. It's a portmanteau of treat and Hitler. So it's like first worlders are treatlers, or they're treatlerites, because they will literally genocide an entire people, the Palestinian people, in pursuit of their treats. And what are those treats? As Prof. Mohammed mentioned, like vacations, paid leave, and so on. So these are things they're willing to do. All these images you see from Palestine, these are things they're willing to do just to maintain that standard of living. So, like for someone in the first world, and as a progressive, presumably, in terms of praxis, how do you balance the messaging where it's like, we need to build workers' power, we need to build it domestically against local capitalists who do have a transnational character. How do we do that while at the same time emphasizing or underscoring the imperialness, the imperial content, the fact that, okay, we're exploited, but like, at the same time, we're being exploited on a lesser level, on a qualitatively lesser level than the third world. And that our exploitation, it becomes motive through imperial super exploitation. So how do you say that, like, okay, you talk about degrowth, like how do you say that, like, yes, you know, like we will end exploitation, or we will lessen your exploitation by domestic capitalists, but at the same time you will need to have a lower standard of living so that, you know, we can offload all of the suffering in the third world. So that's my question. It's a practical question. It's very tentative.
Okay, for the remaining questions, kindly package it very shortly.
Hello, I'm Inigo Pastor I'm a feature staffer of the Philippine Collegian, and I suppose this question might be more appropriate for tomorrow, but I think it's a good follow-up as well to Pao's. It's a practical question as well. Since we're seeing probably what some might view as the largest buildup of military material in the Philippines since the Second World War, effectively, we have VFAs with Japan, we're negotiating VFAs with Canada, France, New Zealand. The last Balikatan exercises had around 20 countries in participation, most of them as observers, but still twice as many as the exercises last year. And there are logistics deals going round and round. The US proposing a new munitions hub in Subic Bay, the Marines back for the first time in 30 years. And to cap it all off, when Bongbong Marcos visited the US a couple of months ago and met with Trump, we heard that he invited Trump to the ASEAN Summit here in the Philippines next year that will take place around maybe April, May, June. And so the big question here is, with this really intensification of attempts to stem the decline of US hegemony by this intensified not only extraction, but military buildup to reinforce that collection of rents and super profits. And of course, these aren't summed up in these single moments, but like Pao was asking, how would you say scholars of this imperial mode of living, as well as mass movements, both in the north and south, should account for this, should face this? Of course, they aren't summed up in single moments, these mass movements, so to speak. And we have to account for our own unique conditions, but to put it briefly, should it look like the Manila Summit of 1966? Should it look like the Battle of Seattle in 1999? Should it look like something different? And that's it in a few sentences.
Okay, next one.
Alright. Hello, good. Is it still the morning or is it the afternoon?
It's the afternoon.
It's already the afternoon. Alright. My name is Joseph Bunagan. I'm from the Institute for Nationalist Studies, and I'm also a student here at the Department of Anthropology. Now, while some of the previous discussion was more focused on the ecological effects of the imperial mode of living, I want to ask a question that's a bit out of left field because it's in relation to women. Now, first in context, the Philippines is very much well known for being one of the largest exporters of workers, especially in domestic labor, nurses in particular. That's something the Philippines is well known for, in fact, stereotyped about. I have family who left this country for America, so it's a bit personal too. Now, on the other hand, in the global north, the standards of living for women have drastically improved. Women get to have better labor conditions, such as I'm very sorry, I have a bit of a stutter. Such as paid time off, maternity leave. They have the option to work. Meanwhile, So just to sum it up, to prevent this from drawing on any longer, I want to ask, how does the imperial mode of living affect the conditions of women? And is there a disparity between the conditions of women in the global north and the global south as a result of this mode of living? Does the exploitation of women in the south help sustain the imperial mode of living in the global north, for women in particular? Sorry, it's a bit.
Thank you for the question. And then last one, contract na lang.
So, I'm Ramon Castillo, undergrad student under the Department of Anthropology. And I would like to ask, how would you, Professor Brand, characterize the condition of alienation in the Marxian sense, given the entrenchment of this imperial mode of living? Do you think it has become a truly world historical phenomenon in a truly existential way, or rather, has it not changed that much, given ideas, phenomena such as combined and uneven development or the subsumption of pre-capitalist modes of production and living? And one more. Aside from Marx's famous proposal of labor vouchers and the critique of the growth program, what would you characterize this because you mentioned production for use values, non-commodity production/production for use. Should we simply return to pre-capitalist provisioning systems? And what do you think about degrowth perspectives like Kohei Saito's explicitly Marxist proposal that centers care systems, the shortening of the working week, and even the working day, etc.?
Okay, thank you po. So just to balikan yung mga questions in the race. So the first question that we need to address is that what are your insights on the role of the state in driving structural changes in society? The next is how can movements build on creating this particular praxis on the messaging regarding IML or other movements as well? And then fifth and overall is that how should we account with this particular development? So if question 4 and 5 are in conjunction with one another. Question 6 is on basically it's a question of how does the Imperial Mode of Living affect the conditions of women, and what is the difference between the global north and the global south? And last one, how can we account alienation as a world historical phenomenon? And para mas madali na lang, what are your ideas on the growth and care systems? The growth and care systems. Care systems. Yeah. So, pwede rin pong sumagot si Ma'am Frances, Sir Bowman? Or do you want to proceed, Sir Frank?
I should start. Yes, this is another talk.
Fantastic. Can we shorten it?
I give you just some, because it's a conversation and we should discuss elsewhere and we have more spaces. And many of your questions and observations make clear that we don't have clear answers. We have to be conscious of the contradictory character. For example, that there are care workers coming from other countries, from Eastern Europe, from the Philippines to the global north, is exploitation. But it's also a result of feminist struggles in the global north. And of course, the scale of organizing societies is national. This is a kind of a characteristic of global capitalism, that global capitalism is fragmented in nation states or regions, if you take the EU. And to understand this, and the struggle is then in Germany and Austria, that those who come, and many of them want to come, that they have decent wages, that they are well paid, which is contradictory because the Austrian or German woman who can afford, let's say, a woman from the Philippines, the precondition that it's not too expensive. But I would claim we need a labor struggle and social security and a legal status, etc., that if they want to come, they can come. But the second point is we need a world where it's not necessary to leave the own country, the own family, the own people to survive or to make a living. This is the point. Yeah. So the first is very immediate, or if I talk about Romanian or Bulgarian, Hungarian workers, that they are not super exploited, that they can go back every other week, etc., to have good living conditions. This is the struggle, and to see both sides. But currently we see in Germany, Europe only the side of the people there, and then the workforce which comes from elsewhere is neglected and exploited. This is kind of the contradictory. The second question is the same. The workers in the north are exploited, but in many cases they don't feel the exploitation. They feel, of course, the everyday life for many people is also not very comfortable. If you work in an automotive factory, this is not a nice work. We just went from a working group in May to BMW in Leipzig. This is not nice to see people working at the assembly line and giving their life to produce cars for the rich. They never can afford the car. But it's not, they feel, because the wage is high, they feel, well, they think, okay, this is the best I can get, the best job I can get in Saxony is to work for BMW, even if it's a shit job. So, but it's not experienced as that I'm disadvantaged. I'm happy that I get my 3,000, 4,000 euros. And here would be my answer, not to say, and I have research projects with and on trade unions, I discuss with trade unions, before I came back to the Philippines, I had dinner with one of the top heads of the metal workers, the largest trade union still in the world, in Germany, the German metal workers. The point is not to say to the workers, you have to give up. The point, it's my political position, is to say also to the workers, we need a different form of well-being. And we come back to what is the public, maybe you don't need so much money because you have a good public transport, you have many things for free, you don't need a car. A car in average costs 400 euro per month. So if I don't have a car, maybe my wage can less, 400 euro less. I want to be brief, but I think this is to convince people in the global north that we can have a different form of well-being. What is difficult to convince people in the global north that they should give up in order to give advantages to people in the global south. It's not because they are bad or whatever. It's not at the screen. So how to create an empathy, how to create an understanding that it's not only people in Germany, or that people elsewhere are connected us. This is the idea of the Imperial Mode of Living, that we want to clarify that this has to do with other realities in the world. And maybe at a concrete level, this is a proposal to create transglobal alliances. Let's say a school class in Manila has an exchange with a school class in Berlin. Via digital means, please don't travel too much, yeah? But you know what I mean, to create an empathy for young people to say, here are 20 people in Manila and I learn them, we meet once a month, an hour, we understand our histories, we understand our background, we understand our desires, our problems, etc., to create an empathy at this very, very concrete level, which does not exist currently. These would be initiatives. So I end, and I'm sorry that I didn't. Maybe two final thoughts. The first is on the role of the state. It's an own lecture. I come from a tradition from Nikos Poulantzas. Some of you might be familiar with. The state is very contradictory, and the state is a terror of struggle. The state is not the instrument of capital, but the state is neither the neutral regulator solving problems. The state is a capitalist, racist, colonial state. But the state is also a subject of struggles. That we have an environmental ministry, probably you have also a social ministry, or the Ministry of Social Affairs, etc. This is an outcome of social struggles, of demands. So to understand the state like this, and we should claim from the state things. But we should be aware that the state per se is linked to domination, to power. Poulantzas has this famous term. It's a material condensation of relationships of forces in this direction. So I would say, yes, we should claim from the state, but we should be aware that the state is patriarchal, colonial, racist. Again, the contradictory character. And to finish, with the battles. Yes, we need local resistances. We need international initiatives. We need to undermine discourses, like the discourse of development. I think with our group in Latin America and with many others, in Latin America you have already a very strong critique of development, of the development dispositive. Many people don't believe that to approach the West, to approach the North is something good. Many people understand, ordinary people, that this has to do with exploitation, destruction, etc., etc. So this is our job also as scholars, as intellectuals, public intellectuals, to undermine these discourses. But this is my final point. I was very active in the ultra-globalization movement, and I knew there, Walden Bellow, and comes tomorrow to the talk as well. So my point is, struggles and battles are very often contingent. We didn't expect what is happening now in Indonesia, or what is happening elsewhere. But what we can do is, as scholars, as organized groups, to learn from history. If there is an uprising, what are the contingent moments of uprising, and how can we intervene that these uprisings kind of really are not just for 2 days or for 2 weeks, but they have a certain continuity, that they have good claims. And for this we need, I always call it, a social movement infrastructure, which is an infrastructure of knowledge, an infrastructure to organize and to give the chance that a movement or alternative proposal can be successful. So I hope you get my point. To acknowledge the contingency, but in the contingent moment of a rapid change, to flourish, to bring to these contingent moments rich knowledge, rich proposals, joy also, to say, yeah, we might be successful. And with all, you know this probably better than I, the powerful know how to, not only to repress, but how to also demotivate social movements, yeah? To frustrate social movements, and to counter this, this would be my final thing. Thank you.
Thank you both for this room. And I think that wraps up our lecture for today. So again, maraming salamat po for attending our public lecture titled The Imperial Mode, How Capitalism Affirms Its Hegemony, the Imperial Mode of Living. And as for a few final reminders,